Hey, Melville Baptist Church, have you ever asked, what does the Bible say about? What does the Bible say about this issue or that issue? What does the Bible say about this political thing that's happening right now? What does the Bible say about how I should respond to what's happening in our world right now? What does the Bible say about who I should date or if I should date? Or what does the Bible say about how I should raise my kids? Or what does the Bible say about, well, just about anything? As a pastor, I get asked that question a fair bit, and I'm always pretty excited when I get asked it because it's part of us figuring out, how do I follow Jesus in this moment in time that I'm living in? What does the Bible say about this? How does God's word give me guidance? And people in all places and in all times have asked that, what does the Bible say about question? But because the question is brought up because of the context that we're in, the situation that we're facing, the moment in life that we're in, sometimes when we see other people dealing with that question, it's going to seem strange to us. We think, well, why are they even asking that? The answer is so obvious to us. Or we look at other people and we think, why aren't they asking the what does the Bible say about question? Because what they're doing is so obviously wrong. But today I want to explore this idea that maybe what does the Bible say about is kind of the wrong question, or at least it's asking it from the wrong angle. One of the places where we see people dealing with that what does the Bible say about question is actually in the biblical book of Galatians that Paul wrote very early in his ministry to this group of churches in the Roman province of Galatia. And the question that they're asking in the Galatian churches seems really strange to us. The question that they're asking is, what does the Bible say about circumcision? But their circumstance, the historical moment they find themselves in, is what gives birth to this question. Because they have within their church a group of people, probably a lot of them with a Jewish background, who understand that circumcision is for them not just a mark, but it is the mark of belonging to God's covenant community. It is the mark of belonging to the family that God has blessed and chosen to make a blessing to all the nations of the earth. It shows you belong. But there's another group of people for whom circumcision doesn't hold that meaning. They come from other backgrounds with other experiences, and they're not sure what they should be doing about this thing that somebody else is telling them this is really, really important. And so Paul, throughout the book, he's going to answer that question really, really clearly. He's going to tell them that they do not need to be circumcised. In fact, he says, if you're a Gentile and you place value on that circumcision, you're missing something really important. You're beginning to rely on works and on effort instead of relying on Christ. So Paul answers the question really, really clearly. But if that's all that he did, the book of Galatians would only be so much help to us. What Paul does is he doesn't only answer the question, but he begins to show us a way that we can answer the question for ourselves. He begins to show us a way that we can ask a deeper question, actually, than what does the Bible say about? So I want to take you to just a portion of that letter. It's Galatians Chapter 4, and I'm going to read the first 7 verses. Paul says this: "What I am saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. He is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And since you are a son, God has made you also an heir." So I invited you to pay attention to how Paul is answering the question. And the first thing I want you to pay attention to is that Paul sees this timeline in the way that he answers the question. Several times throughout this passage, he makes use of the imagery of time passing from being a child to being fully grown. When Christ comes, it's at the fullness of time. There's time unfolding. And the reason that Paul does that is because he sees the Bible differently than we often do. When we ask what does the Bible say about question, often we think of the Bible as kind of a reference work, something like an old-fashioned encyclopedia or Wikipedia. And if you have a question about a topic, you look it up and you find the answer. But if we treat the Bible that way, often we find that it doesn't work really well. because we find a bit of an answer over here in the middle and another bit of an answer over there at the end, and then maybe we have to go back all the way to the beginning to get another piece of the answer, and then we have to take all these parts and try and fit them together. And sometimes those parts, they don't even seem to fit together really well. For example, if you were an Old Testament person trying to figure out who you should marry as a Jewish man, you might read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and come out with one answer. It cannot be a foreign woman. And then you might read the book of Ruth and think, well, that seems to be giving me a very different answer. And these clues that we have to jump around to find our answers to the what does the Bible say about question, and the idea that sometimes the answers, they don't fit together quite as nicely as we might like, is a clue that we're maybe reading the Bible the wrong way. And Paul would say, why don't you read the Bible instead as something that includes parable and prophecy and legal code, but all put together. This Bible, it's kind of like a story. From beginning, from creation, all the way to consummation, and things are unfolding over the course of this story. And if you begin to read the Bible as a story, it opens up the possibility that the things that the characters say in chapter 1 of the story aren't going to be the same things that they say in chapter 2 or chapter 3 or chapter 4. Now, of course, you can't just plug chapter 2 in from nowhere. It's got to be connected to what comes before. But if you go to a play or watch a movie, you don't expect the actors to say and do the same things over and over again. You expect some progression. And that's exactly what Paul is telling us here in Galatians Chapter 4, that as the story unfolds, there's some progression. So Paul, throughout the letter of Galatians, he pays really careful attention to time. When stuff happened, that's really, really important. The other thing that Paul does is he picks up this imagery of adoption. He says that as the story has unfolded, this story that the Galatians aren't just reading, but the story of God's involvement in the world that they're actually a part of, because of Jesus, these Galatians, they've been adopted, they've been brought into the family. Now, adoption is, for most of us, a familiar picture. We maybe haven't been through it ourselves, but we have some idea of what it means. It's important that we think for a moment about what Paul is thinking about when he talks about adoption. We know that there were different ideas about adoption that swirled around in Paul's world. And some of those ideas, they came from the world of Greco-Roman mythology. Adoption played a part in the stories that they told about the world and how it came to be. But that's not Paul's world. I mean, that's not the stuff that he swam in and consumed and thought about all the time. And Paul's language here is different than the language that comes from those stories. Another thing we know about adoption at Paul's point in time is that in the Roman world, that sons could be adopted, that a son could move from the care of one father into the care of another father, and that was often done for the purposes of inheritance, so that the inheritance and the rights would be passed on down the line as the father, as the patriarch of the house wanted it to be done. That happened in Paul's world. But it's also important that we keep in mind that Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, that the book that he'd consumed whole was the Bible, and that's how he saw the world. That's what explained and made the world make sense to Paul was Scripture. And Scripture, for Paul, what we call the Old Testament, that has a story of adoption in it as well. So I mentioned Abraham earlier, and Paul mentions him in this letter as well. In fact, in the chapter just before the one that we read. And Abraham is called out of Ur of the Chaldees, and he's given this blessing that he's going to become his descendants will become this great nation, and that they will spread blessing around to all their neighbors. And Abraham, at one point, he gets frustrated because things aren't moving as quickly as he'd like them to move. So he tells God. He expresses that to God. And God, again, he says, Abraham, I'm your shield, and your reward will be very great. So he reinstates the promise. But he also begins to make that timeline, that movement of events clear. And one of the things he says to Abraham in this moment in Genesis chapter 15 is that Abraham's descendants will actually be slaves in a foreign nation. We know, looking back, that he was talking about Egypt. But that's not the end of the story. It's just a moment in it. And that God plans to rescue the people from this slavery in Egypt. And that's what happens. God rescues the people from slavery in Egypt. It's not smooth. It's not easy. Pharaoh competes. He says, no, they're my people. And God insists, no, they're my people. The more God calls, the more the people of Israel seem to resist. But God insists, these are my people. And that all gets summed up in this really beautiful phrase in the book of Hosea in chapter 11. The prophet says, on behalf of God, out of Egypt I have called my son. It's the language of adoption. You were somewhere else in another home, and I brought you into mine. I made you my son. I made you my people. And Paul says that very thing that God accomplished for Israel in the Exodus, he's accomplished for everyone now who believes in Jesus Christ. That in the fullness of time, Jesus Christ came and opened up the door so that God might call us to be his sons and to be his daughters. And Paul's point in saying this is that the moment in the story has changed. That the time for the legal codes, including circumcision, it's past. That you are no longer children running about, but you are full-grown sons and daughters with all the rights of the heir. And that's a super challenging idea. And it's an idea that in Paul's day and in many moments since, it's scared people. Because it seems like Paul is just flinging wide open these doors and giving people this incredible freedom because there's no law, there's no black and white. You are just sons and full grown, and you can now do what you want. And what will stop us from going all prodigal, from going off the rails, if there's no law to keep us on track? I think one of the things Paul would tell us was, hold on, wait a second. How effective was the law really at keeping you on track? All those rules, did they really guide you to righteousness and faithfulness? Or did you just disobey them? How many of us who would say, no, there needs to be black and whites and clear guidelines, and people need to know what they can do and what they can't do, could look back at our own life and say, man, there were moments when I knew what the right thing to do was and I didn't do it. When I knew what the wrong thing was and I still did it. The law isn't as effective at keeping us on track as we often think. So we don't need to be scared by this freedom that Paul has given to the Galatian church, that Christ has given to the Galatian church and to us. You are sons. You don't need nannies and teachers bossing you about anymore. You have received the full inheritance as adopted sons and daughters of God. You know, when I was a younger dad, in fact, my oldest child was just entering elementary school. She was playing Timbits soccer. And we stood at the edge of the Timbits soccer field one day, and we began this conversation with other parents that I've never seen before, and I haven't actually seen since, as best as I can recall. But it turned out that they were believers, that they were following Jesus as well. And with our kids at about the same age, we talked about this kind of painful experience where you let your children go into this new environment where they will learn and experience things that I'd really rather they don't learn and experience. And in particular, for her kids, this mom was saying they got on the school bus and they came back at the end of the day and they said, Mom, some of the big kids swear. What's a parent to do in moments like that? I don't want my kids to cuss. So you can read them the riot act, give them a list of words that they're not supposed to say, and maybe that would work. But this mom, she chose a different approach. She told her boys, you know who you are because you know who our family is. You know the ways that we talk to each other and the ways that we don't. You know how we interact with each other. And she told her boys, you've got a God-shaped conscience as well. And when you hear stuff that isn't right, that isn't good, God's going to work on your conscience. So you know how you're supposed to act when you get on that school bus with the bigger kids who cuss. Paul isn't doing anything all that different here in the Galatian letter. He's saying, here's who you are. You are sons, you are daughters of God who have been adopted in the fullness of time because of what Christ has done. This is the moment in the story that you live in. Now go and live it. So here's my proposal to you, that sometimes in the midst of the confusion of the moments that we face, whether it's should I do this job or that job, or can I do this or can I do that, or is that allowable or is it not? The question we ask is, what does the Bible say about? And maybe the best way to fill that question is, what does the Bible say about me? What does the Bible say about who I am? How in this circumstance, in this situation, can I act as a son, as a daughter, as a child of God? So that's my prayer, my hope for you, for us as a church, for whoever takes a moment to listen to this, that we would begin to define ourselves as sons and daughters of God and behave accordingly. God bless.